The cowboy had nothing but $3 to his name, and he used them all to buy freedom for a woman no one else saw as human. But before we get to that, hit that like button and let us know where you're tuning in from. The trading post at the edge of the town looked like it had been forgotten by time. Its boards were faded and warped, patched with whatever junk the owner could get his hands on. Scrap tin, a busted wagon wheel, even stretched hide stitched across cracks where daylight leaked through. Inside, the air reeked of sweat-damp leather stale tobacco and the sour rot of spilled whiskey that had long soaked into the floorboards. It was the kind of place where rough men bartered pelts for cheap whiskey and picked up supplies before vanishing into the hard stretch of nowhere. Eli McGraw shoved the door open with his shoulder. The hinges groaned in protest. His boots wore the dust of the trail, and the brim of his weather-beaten hat hung low, shadowing most of his face. Not far off, Asha stayed close to Jed Crow, helping him with the corral, passing him nails, her shoulder brushing his like a silent tether. Ever since the storm, the bond between them had grown quiet but unshakable. One afternoon, a rider came by for water at Jed's well, a trader with loose lips and a lazy manner. "Those ranch hands got drunk again," he said, half laughing. "Sheriff's watching 'em now, reckon they won't pull any stunts soon." He tipped his hat and rode on. Jed stood a long while after holding the bucket rope with slack fingers. Relief washed over him, but it brought weight too. He told himself he'd just head into town, get what he needed, and be gone before the evening crowd rolled in. But the place wasn't as quiet as he'd hoped. At the far end of the room where sunlight bled through splintered boards, a man in a greasy vest hauled forward a young Apache woman. Her wrists were bound with rough-cut rope, the skin beneath raw and red. Barefoot, her toes were torn by splinters and grit. The deer-hide dress clinging to her was ripped and hanging in tatters, neckline torn, side split wide open. Still, she stood tall even though her breath came in ragged pulls, and her hair clung to her sweat-damp face. Silas Grady, the trader, lifted her arm like she was nothing more than meat. Strong enough to work, he slurred breath thick with whiskey. Quiet, too. You won't find better stock in this whole damn territory. The words made Eli's gut churn. A few of the men nearby chuckled darkly. One flipped a coin in the air, caught it with a smirk. Another leaned forward, eyeing her like a prize steer. $2. 3, another called. The woman didn't flinch. Chin-high gaze averted. But Eli saw the rapid rise of her chest, the tight clench of her jaw. He shifted his stance, fists curling at his sides. Told himself to stay out of it. It wasn't his fight. Hell, he barely had 2 horses, a barn half fallen, and cows eating more than he could afford. This wasn't his trouble. But he couldn't pull his eyes away. Silas yanked the rope again, jerking her forward. She stumbled hard, her knee hit the planks with a crack. She winced, but rose straight again, pride keeping her upright. Eli saw the tremble in her arms, the fear behind her steady stare. Something twisted in his chest. He thought of his sister, long gone now, and the kind of rage he'd unleash if someone had treated her like that. He thought about the lonely silence of his land freedom, sure, but sometimes it felt more like a punishment. The bidding started up again. Coins flashed, hands calloused and cruel. Silas pulled the rope like he was showing off a prize mule. Eli's hand went to his belt pouch. He knew exactly what was in it. Enough silver for flour beans and a pinch of salt. Enough to get through spring if he stretched it thin. To spend it now meant lean weeks ahead, maybe worse. He had seconds to decide. Stay quiet or step in. If he turned away, she'd end up with one of these bastards. Men who didn't see her as human. Just flesh. His jaw clenched. Then his boots moved before his mind could stop them. "I'll take her," Eli said, voice rough as gravel but steady. The room stilled. Laughter bubbled from a few men thinking it a joke. Silas narrowed his eyes, glanced at Eli's pouch as the cowboy tossed it onto the table. Coins scattered across the wood, ringing loud in the tense quiet. It wasn't much. It was everything he had. Silas Grady's grin stretched, wider yellow teeth flashing. "Not much left in your pocket, cowboy, but it'll do." He swept the coins into his calloused hand, then shoved the rope toward Eli McGraw. For a beat, Eli just stood there, staring down at the rough hemp in his palm, then up at the girl. Her eyes locked on his, wary and sharp, but beneath the suspicion was something else, confusion, maybe even a flicker of hope, buried deep under layers of guarded silence. She wasn't grateful. Not yet. Her eyes weren't saying thank you. They were asking why. Eli didn't have an answer. Nothing he could say would make sense, not even to himself. He eased the knot loose on her wrists, just enough for her to walk without tearing skin, and murmured low, just for her to hear, "Come on." Outside, the afternoon sun beat down hard on the dust-packed street. Folks paused mid-step. Some whispered. A few curled their lips and spat. Eli kept moving, ignoring them, guiding her to where his horse was tied, beneath the shade of a leaning hitch post. She hesitated, eyeing the animal, then him. For a split second, Eli figured she might bolt, but then she set her hand on the saddle and pulled herself up. Her steps were unsteady, but her will was sharp as flint. Eli mounted behind her, took the reins, and without another word nudged the horse into motion. They left the post behind, dust curling around the hooves as they rode. He had no plan, no road map for what came next. All he knew was this: he couldn't have walked away. That rope in his hand had bound his future tighter than hers. His money was gone, his life, about to turn down a path with no map. They rode in silence down a rutted trail, the town fading into nothing but a smudge behind them. The wind stirred the dust, kicking up behind the horse's hooves, the fading light painting the world in gold and rust. Eli sat stiff in the saddle, jaw clenched beneath the shadow of his hat, reins gripped firm, though unease churned in his gut. Behind them, the trading post was swallowed by the open range, but its sounds, the laughter, the mutters, the weight of 100 judging eyes still clung like the stink of sweat on a wool shirt. He didn't look back. He didn't have to. He could feel it. The whole damn town had seen him spend his last coin on an Apache woman. Some thought him a fool, others worse. And plenty reckoned they knew exactly what kind of man he was now. But the truth, that was harder to pin down. The girl, Ayanna Redbird, sat stiff in front of him, shoulders tight, long black hair catching in the breeze. She hadn't said a word since climbing up, and Eli hadn't expected her to. He kept a small space between them, his chest barely brushing her back. But the tension in her body told him she was coiled tight, ready to leap if given reason. He wouldn't have blamed her. Part of him almost hoped she'd run, if it meant finding her own way. But another part, the part that made him act in that trading post, wasn't ready to let her vanish into the hills alone, barefoot and hunted. They rode until the last edge of town was long behind them. The land stretched wide and open now, rolling scrub and scattered mesquite, the horizon bleeding red as the sun slid down. His cabin lay just a few miles ahead, nestled near a thin creek that carved through the valley. Still, the silence between them made every mile feel longer. He cleared his throat voice, rough from disuse. "Name's Eli McGraw," he said low. Not sure if she'd answer at all. "Got a place a ways out. Ain't much. Dry roof, warm fire. There's food." She didn't respond at first, didn't even glance back. Then, soft and guarded as a whisper on the wind, she said, "Ayanna." The word was fast, careful, but clear. Eli gave a nod she couldn't see. At least now he had something to call her that wasn't girl. He kept his gaze on the trail ahead, but his mind wandered. How long had she been tied like that? Where had Silas Grady even gotten her raider soldiers? Or worse, men who made coin off the broken and the lost? He didn't ask. He didn't need to. The stiff way she sat, the shallow breath in her chest, it was answer enough. By the time they reached his place, dusk had fallen. The cabin stood small and weather-worn, built by Eli's own hands over years of quiet labor. One room, lean-to corral beside it. 2 horses inside swishing tails. A barn sagged off the back, patched with rough boards. Roof leaked in spring, but it held against wind. Smoke stains crept up the chimney, and the front door gave a low groan as he pushed it open. It wasn't much, but it was his. He dismounted boots, landing solid in the dirt, then held the reins while Ayanna slid down. She moved slow, cautious, like she expected a trick. Her bare feet hit the ground with a wince. Eli caught sight of the raw skin on her soles, dirt packed in deep. He wanted to lift her, carry her inside, but he didn't. She'd see pity in that maybe weakness, too. And she didn't look like the kind who forgave, either. Inside the cabin was dim but warmer. Eli lit a lantern, its glow flickering over the scarred table, the cot shoved against one wall, and the hearth where morning's ashes still held a hint of heat. Smoke, leather, and horse lingered in the air. He hung his hat on a peg, then looked back. Ayanna stood at the threshold, shoulders squared, eyes scanning every corner of the room. She didn't relax, didn't move from the door. Eli said nothing. Just let her watch. Let her decide if this place would feel like a trap or a pause in the long run. He bent near the hearth, stirring the coals, coaxing fire back to life. Behind him, she remained still, but she hadn't run, and somehow that mattered more than anything. Eli McGraw hung his hat on the wooden peg near the door, then crossed to the hearth and crouched low, stirring the ashes until a few embers sparked to life. Ayanna Redbird stood rigid by the entrance, her spine straight, eyes flicking around the room like she was mapping every possible exit. She didn't sit, didn't ease up. Eli moved slow, deliberate, every motion plain and calm, making sure she saw he wasn't about to crowd her. "I'll get some food going," he said, voice, even hands steady. He grabbed a dented tin pot, filled it with water from a bucket by the door, and set it over the flame. From a nearby sack, he scooped beans and dropped them in, added a pinch of salt from a small jar. It was a routine he'd repeated more nights than he could count. But tonight, every movement felt different, watched. He could feel her gaze on his back, like a blade pressed just shy of skin. When the beans softened, he ladled some onto a tin plate and set it down on the table, then stepped back, arms loose, giving her space. For a moment, she didn't move. Her eyes darted from him to the food, then back again, mistrust written clear across her face. Then slowly, like she was testing a snare, Ayanna stepped forward and eased down onto the bench. She picked up the spoon and began to eat careful quiet, but the speed of each swallow told Eli just how long it had been since she'd had a real meal. He busied himself with his rifle across the room, cleaning it slow, giving her her distance. But inside his thoughts were tangled. Why had he spent the last of his silver? What did she think he wanted in return? He didn't have those answers, not for her, not even for himself. All he knew was that seeing her on that platform had shattered something inside him, and if he'd turned away, he wouldn't have been able to look himself in the mirror again. When she finished eating, she placed the spoon down with care. Then, for the first time since they'd left town, her eyes rose to meet his. There was no gratitude in them, not yet. Just a sharp, quiet weighing of who he was and whether he was worth fearing. She was measuring him plain as day. Eli didn't flinch. He nodded once. "You'll sleep in here by the fire. Cot's mine, but the floor's warm enough." He paused, voice low. "Tomorrow I'll see about getting you some shoes. Then you can figure if you want to stay or go. Up to you." She didn't reply, but her eyes lingered on him just a second longer before drifting back to the fire's glow. Eli stretched out on the cot, boots still on rifle, within reach. He stared at the ceiling while the sound of her settling down near the hearth rustled faintly in the quiet. His mind reeled with doubt. He was flat broke now, hadn't a clue how to make it through the next stretch. And here he was, sharing his roof with a woman who had every reason to hate his kind, who might vanish into the dark the first chance she got. But as sleep tugged at him, something stirred in his chest he hadn't felt in years. The cabin didn't feel quite so empty anymore. Before the sun had touched the sky, Eli woke same as always. The room was still and quiet, save for the faint pop of coals in the hearth. He turned his head and saw Ayanna curled beneath the blanket just as she'd been. She hadn't moved much. Her breath came soft but shallow. Her knees were drawn tight to her chest, like she'd trained herself to disappear into the smallest space possible. In the fire's dim glow, Eli noticed the raw skin at her wrists, where the rope had rubbed her raw. He sat up, swung his legs over the side of the cot, and laced up his boots. For years, this had been routine wake before light split wood, tend horses, check the cattle. Nothing broke that rhythm except age creeping in his bones. But now there was someone else breathing in his space, and it changed the way each step felt. He wondered not for the last time if she'd still be there when he returned. Outside morning bit cold against his face. The land stretched wide, no neighbors in sight. His spread was 80 acres more scrub than soil, not much for grazing. 2 horses, 3 head of cattle, a barn that leaned like it was tired, fences sagging, a roof that dripped every spring. Still, it was his. Until yesterday, that had been enough. He grabbed the axe and got to work splitting logs, stacking them tight against the wall. Each crack of wood rang loud across the barren land, but his thoughts never strayed far from the cabin. What came next? He'd bought her freedom, but where would she go? No shoes. No supplies. And with soldiers in the hills, and her people forced north, there weren't many places she could run that didn't end in ruin. By the time he stepped back inside, the sky was turning pale gray. Ayanna was awake, sitting cross-legged by the fire. Same sharp eyes watching him as the night before. She hadn't moved anything. The plate still sat on the tablespoon, resting just so. Her hair was down, tangled, but striking in the lantern light. Eli dropped the fresh-cut wood near the hearth. "You eat?" he asked, though it was clear she hadn't touched anything. She gave one slow shake of her head. He turned back to the stove and busied himself again. More beans, same pot. It wasn't much, but it was what he had. As he moved about, he could feel her gaze tracking every step, calculating. Not trust, just vigilance, like she was memorizing every movement, every reach, every inch he covered. When the beans were ready, he slid a plate toward her. No words, just offering and waiting. This time, Ayanna Redbird didn't wait as long. She ate with quiet purpose, each spoonful fast, but controlled her back still straight as a fence post ready to leap if need be. Eli McGraw leaned against the edge of the table. Arms crossed, keeping his voice calm and even. "I'll ride into town tomorrow," he said, watching her, but not pushing. "Get you some shoes. Maybe a proper dress. You'll need both if you're fixin' to decide whether to stay or ride on." Her spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. She looked at him, square eyes narrowing just a hair, as if trying to figure if the choice was real. Was he handing her a decision, or just playing at it? Eli didn't flinch. He held her gaze steady. After a long pause, she lowered the spoon. "I don't trust you," she said at last, her voice coarse and edged like river rock. Her English had that clipped second-hand rhythm, but the words still cut clean. Eli nodded once. Slow and sure. "Don't blame you." He didn't argue. Trust couldn't be traded for coins, not even ones paid in full. She turned back to her food slower now, not cautious, but thoughtful. The silence in the room thickened, but didn't smother. Eli let her eat, let the stillness hang. When she finished, he said, "I don't want nothing from you." His tone stayed level. "Not your cooking, not your work, not what those men thought." He stepped closer to the fire, voice low but firm. "You're free to go. But you won't get far without boots on your feet or food in your bag. All I ask, wait till you got both." Ayanna's jaw worked tight. Her gaze dropped to the flames. And for the first time since he'd seen her chained on that trading floor, she looked less carved from stone and more like a soul worn heavy. She didn't speak, but she didn't argue either. Later that morning, Eli saddled his gelding and rode the fence line, eyes drifting back toward the cabin more than once. He kept picturing her out there barefoot, bleeding, walking alone through the thorny brush under a ruthless sun. No water, no shelter, no help. The image tightened his gut in ways he couldn't name. When he returned at midday, the cabin stood quiet. But she was still there. She'd tidied the table, stacked the firewood he'd split earlier, and swept out the dirt using a willow branch she must have found herself. Small things, but they hit him like thunder. He hadn't asked, hadn't expected it. Eli paused in the doorway, just watching. For years, the only sound in this place had been his own boots and breath. Now her presence filled it, quiet, steady. That night when he spread the blanket for her near the hearth again, she hesitated. Her eyes found him as he lay on the cot, gaze heavy with questions she hadn't spoken yet. He could feel her measuring him, still waiting to see if he'd turn out like every other man. Eli rolled onto his side, facing the wall, kept his hands to himself, kept his breath even. Sleep came slow, but when it finally took him, he realized something had shifted. The quiet in his home wasn't as cold as before. Morning broke clear and sharp, the kind that cut clean. Sound carried farther in the thin air. Eli had been up before the sun, brushing frost from the trough and checking the corral gate. His body moved like it always had, by habit, but his thoughts stayed tangled. Every time he stepped out, he half expected to come back to an empty cabin. But when he opened the door again, she was still there. Ayanna sat cross-legged by the fire, pulling thin strands of dried willow bark between her fingers, twisting them into cord. Her movements were quiet, precise, almost soothing. Eli watched her for a moment. She could have slipped away while he was down by the creek, or working the barn. But she hadn't. She'd stayed. He said nothing at first, just nodded, hung up his hat, pulled out a flour sack, and measured enough to make breakfast cakes. She looked at him then, but when he glanced back, her eyes darted away. "You could have run," he said finally, his voice low, not accusing, just truth, laid bare. Her hands paused, then kept working. "No shoes, no water, no tribe," she answered after a beat. Her words were clipped, but they hit solid. "Nowhere to go." Eli felt those words settle in the room like dust. He knew the feel of nowhere, the weight of loss. After the war, After fever took Mary Beth and little Tommy in the same cruel winter, he'd shut himself off, spoke little, trusted less, worked his land until his back damn near gave out scraping coin together to buy this patch when a friend passed on without kin. He hadn't told her that, but the truth of it sat behind his ribs pressing. He stirred the skillet over the fire, the scent of flour crisping in hot oil. Then he said, "I'll ride into town later, bring back boots. Something better than that torn-up dress, too." Her eyes dropped to the frayed neckline she wore, and for the first time her hand came up to shield it, not out of shame, but quiet instinct. She didn't say thank you, didn't have to. But she didn't protest either. By mid-morning, Eli had saddled the horse. He paused in the doorway, glanced back at her one last time, and for a reason he couldn't name, he hoped more than anything that she'd still be there when he came back. "You'll be safe here. Don't open that door for anyone," Eli McGraw said firmly as he grabbed his coat. Ayanna Redbird tilted her head, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "Who would come?" Eli's jaw tensed. "Sometimes traders pass through. Neighbors, maybe. Not often, but if they see you, there'll be talk." He didn't need to say what kind of talk. She understood. Her eyes said so. The ride into town felt longer than usual. Every mile weighed heavy on his shoulders. Eli kept his hat brim low and his words fewer than usual when he stepped inside Clyde Dobbins's dry goods store. He bought a plain cotton dress, durable, nothing fancy, and a pair of worn but sturdy shoes close to her size. When Clyde raised a questioning brow, Eli met it with silence. Just paid up and walked out the bundle wrapped tight under his arm. Back at the cabin, Ayanna was right where he'd left her, feeding small sticks into the fire like a ritual. When she spotted the package, suspicion clouded her face, as though expecting a catch. He didn't explain. Just set it down beside her. "For you." Her hands hovered over the fabric, weighing it like it might carry strings. She unfolded the dress slowly, wariness etched deep in her brow. When nothing followed, no commands, no conditions, she folded it neatly and laid it aside, her face unreadable as stone. Days slipped into a rhythm neither of them had asked for. Eli worked sunup to sundown, splitting logs, patching the leaning barn roof, mending fence wire that refused to stay straight. Ayanna stayed close to the cabin, but never idle. She swept the floor with that same willow branch, carried water from the creek in a dented tin pail, stirred beans at the stove without being asked. She did it quiet, no words, no warmth. Not kindness survival. At night, they remained on opposite ends of the room. Eli slept on the cot boots still on rifle, always within reach. Ayanna lay on her blanket near the fire. They didn't speak unless it was needed, but the air between them started to shift. What once was brittle silence became something else still, but no longer sharp. It was a shared stillness, and in it they began to recognize the shape of each other's presence. Eli noticed things, the pride in how Ayanna held herself upright, even when bone-tired. The slight limp she carried, likely from when she'd been shoved to the platform back at the post. He wondered if she'd taken beatings before. He never asked. He saw the way her expression softened just a little when she moved near his horse, the only time she seemed unguarded. Ayanna noticed him too. She watched how he moved, slow, deliberate. Never rushed her, never stood too close. She paid attention to where he set his tools, how he cursed under his breath when a gate latch jammed. He never raised his voice, never laid a hand on her even when silence stretched thin. That alone made him different from most men she had known. On the fourth day, a lone rider cut across the ridge, Eli spotted him while fixing the gate. Wade Boone. Loose with his liquor, looser with his mouth. Eli's stomach twisted. If Wade saw Ayanna gossip, would beat the sun to town. He strode back into the cabin, boots landing heavy. Ayanna looked up from where she sat, mending the hem of her new dress, using slivers of that same willow cord. "Someone?" she asked. Neighbor Eli said flat. "Keep low, away from the window." "Way." She obeyed without protest, slipping into the corner where shadows swallowed her whole. Eli stood by the door, listening until the hoofbeats faded. Then he exhaled slowly. It was only a matter of time. And when folks started asking questions, they wouldn't be kind. That evening, sitting beside the fire's warm glow, Ayanna finally asked the thing she'd carried in her eyes since the first day. "Why'd you do it?" she said quiet. "Why spend your coins?" Eli stared into the flames, his voice low and even. Couldn't stomach watching it, that's all. She studied him long, like his answer didn't make sense. In her world, men didn't give without taking, didn't help without claiming. But he didn't add more. He leaned back, crossed his arms, eyes closing against the flicker of the firelight. The silence between them remained, but it didn't feel like a wall anymore. By the fifth sunrise, something unspoken had changed inside that cabin. The chores stayed the same: wood, to split water, to haul fences, to mend beans to boil. But now, there were two rhythms walking the same beat. The floorboards carried more than just Eli's steps. Ayanna moved softly, but her presence was felt. Her sweeping, her gentle steps toward the creek. The quiet clink of the spoon in the pot. At first it rattled Eli. Then slowly it settled into something he couldn't quite name. Ayanna's health was improving. The hollow in her cheeks softened with steady meals. The rope burns around her wrists began to scab, though she still rubbed them without thinking, as if phantom cords still bound her there. Her feet, torn and raw from going too long without boots, stayed tender. Eli noticed how she'd wince when she crossed the packed dirt floor, how she tried to hide it with straight shoulders and steady breath. But he saw all of it. Eli. McGraw left the shoes beside her blanket without saying a word. Ayanna Redbird didn't touch them at first. But after a few days she started wearing them short walks outside, breaking them in slowly, like someone learning the feel of freedom step by step. Eli never asked where she came from or how she ended up chained to a post like livestock. Those answers might come in time or never at all. What mattered was that she was here now, and Eli knew this land well enough to understand she didn't have anywhere safer to go. But news was already drifting like smoke. On a supply run into town, Eli could feel the weight of every glance like burrs under his skin. Clyde Dobbins, the storekeeper, kept his mouth mostly shut, but his eyes were sharp curiosity edged with judgment. Outside near the saloon, a couple ranch hands leaned in and murmured when they saw him, their snickers biting like cold wind. He ignored them, but it burned. Wade Boone must have run his mouth after spotting her near the corral. Word was moving fast, and rumors in a town like theirs didn't stay rumors for long. When Eli returned home, Ayanna was standing by the fence, her hand resting gently on his gelding's flank. She glanced up as he approached, watchful, but not as skittish as before. Seeing her out in the open again stirred something uneasy in him. If one neighbor had seen her once, another surely could. But he said nothing, just handed her the bundle from town. Salt, coffee, a bit of dried pork. That night as they sat by the fire, she spoke first. "They talk," she said quietly. Eli glanced over a little, caught off guard. Her voice was soft but steady. He gave a short nod. "Some," Her jaw clenched. Bad talk. He didn't answer right away, just stared into the flames like they might offer better words than he could find. Most folks don't understand, he said at last. Don't want to. But this is my land, my home. Ain't their business who I share it with. Ayanna studied him, her face unreadable in the firelight. Then she turned back to the flames. She didn't bring it up again, but the weight of her question still hung between them. How long until talk turned to trouble? Days rolled by, quiet and steady. Eli noticed the changes in small things. When she stirred beans at the stove, she set some aside for him, without asking. When he came back from working fence, she'd already stacked fresh wood near the hearth. They still didn't talk much, but the gestures spoke louder than words. At night, he stayed on the cot. She took the blanket near the fire, and sometimes when the flames burned low, he'd find his eyes drifting toward the shape of her. Under that blanket, the soft rhythm of her breathing, the quiet curve of her shoulders. He told himself to look away, and most nights he did, but not always. One evening, as he sat working leather on a busted saddle strap, she stepped behind him to reach the shelf. Her hip brushed his shoulder, a light touch, hardly more than a whisper. He froze. She didn't flinch, didn't apologize. Maybe she hadn't noticed, or maybe she had, and chose to ignore it. Eli's hands paused on the strap, then resumed jaw tight as boot leather. Ayanna, for her part, had begun to study him too quietly without letting it show. She watched the sweat darken his shirt when he worked under the sun, saw the creases in his brow when tools failed him, felt the stillness in him that wasn't anger, but grief, maybe. Old grief buried deep. She didn't let him see her watching. But at night, as he turned toward the wall, she'd linger a moment longer in the firelight before settling in. One night, a cold wind rattled the cabin shutters. The fire burned lower than usual, and Ayanna pulled her blanket tighter but still shivered. Eli noticed. He sat up, hesitating. "You want another blanket?" She looked at him, her gaze sharp, then softened. "You give everything," she said. "Coins, food, clothes. Why?" The question cut deeper than he expected. He looked down at his hands, rough and cracked from years of work, the leather strap hanging forgotten. "Because I couldn't leave you there," he said simply. "That's reason enough." She studied him like trying to weigh the honesty in his voice. After a moment, she gave a quiet nod and drew the blanket tighter around herself. She didn't thank him, not with words. But something in her posture relaxed, like a wall inside her had lost a brick or two. To Eli, the cabin no longer felt like just a roof above his head. It felt heavier now, fuller, like every footstep, every shared silence meant something. He knew trust didn't come easy. Not for her. Maybe not for him either. But she was still here. She hadn't run. That meant something. As the firelight flickered across her face, casting soft shadows over her strong cheekbones and the quiet curve of her shoulders, Eli realized a truth he hadn't dared touch in years. This silence wasn't survival anymore. It was the beginning of something neither of them had yet learned how to name. The days that followed carried that unspoken shift. The chores stayed the same, mending fences, hauling water, splitting kindling. But the air between them had changed. There were longer glances, pauses that stretched just past ordinary, the soft brushing of fingers when passing a tin cup or sharing a loaf of bread. They never spoke of it, but it was there, and it was growing. Eli McGraw kept his distance not out of coldness but from habit, from caution. Still, he couldn't deny the shift in the air. That morning, as he saddled his horse for another ride into town, He caught Ayanna Redbird standing in the doorway watching him. She wore the cotton dress he'd brought her cinched at the waist with a strip of leather cord. It fit her better than that torn deerskin ever had, though faint rope burns still marred her bare shoulders. He realized he was staring, then tore his eyes away. "You need anything?" he asked, voice even. Her brow creased slightly like she wasn't sure if he meant it. "No," she replied. He gave a short nod, swung into the saddle, and rode off. She stayed in the doorway until his figure vanished over the ridge. Town felt colder than usual, the kind of cold that had nothing to do with the wind. Whispers had turned sharp. A man outside the saloon didn't bother keeping his voice down. "McGraw's got himself a squaw up in that cabin," he said. "Paid for her same as a mule." Laughter followed hard, mean laughter. Eli clenched his jaw but kept walking. He didn't give them the satisfaction of a glance. He finished his business quick, kept his head low, and got the hell out of there. But the words clung to him like burrs digging in deep. Back at the cabin, the smell of stew greeted him. Ayanna stood by the hearth, stirring a pot with quiet focus. She'd used some of the dried pork he'd brought the week before. When he walked in, her eyes met his steady searching. "They speak of me," she said softly. Not a question, a fact. He set the sack of grain down and met her gaze. "They don't know you," he said, "and they sure as hell don't matter." Her mouth drew tight, and she stirred the pot harder than needed. Words matter. They follow. He didn't argue. He leaned back against the wall, arms folded. "Let 'em talk. This is my land. My home. Not theirs." Something in his tone steadied her, though doubt still flickered in her eyes like wind-tossed embers. That night the wind howled against the shutters. Eli threw another log on the fire. He sat at the table, oiling his rifle, while Ayanna worked a thin cord through the hem of her dress. The silence between them stretched out, but it wasn't empty. It was quiet like a river beneath ice, still but alive. Then she broke it. "The man who sold me," she began, voice low. "He came with soldiers. Took many from our camp. Some were killed, others worse." Her voice cracked, but she pushed through. "They sell us like cattle, use us. You paid too, but you're not like them." Eli froze cloth, motionless on the barrel. Her words cut deep. Not cruel, but clean and honest. He set the rifle down slow and sure. "I didn't buy you to keep you," he said. "I paid to stop them." She searched his face for any flicker of falsehood. Finding none, she gave a small nod. Still, mistrust clung to her like a second skin. She pulled the blanket tighter and turned back to the fire. Later, as flames dimmed to embers, she shivered beneath the thin wool. From the cot, Eli noticed. He hesitated, then stood and crossed to the trunk. Pulling out another blanket, he brought it to her. "You'll be warmer with this," he said, holding it out. She looked up, eyes guarded but softer than before. Slowly she reached out her fingers, brushing his. The touch lingered, neither of them pulling away right away. His breath caught. He stepped back fast, retreating to the cot and lowering himself like every muscle in his body had gone tight. He stared at the ceiling for a long time, the storm in his chest refusing to settle. The next morning something had changed again. Ayanna moved more freely, her steps less guarded. She even asked him with a little stumble in her words how to grind corn into meal. He showed her guiding her hands on the stone. Their fingers touched, and though she pulled back, it wasn't sharp like before. That evening over supper, she studied him through the firelight. "You live alone long time?" He nodded. Since the war. Since my wife and boy passed. He didn't dress it up. Just said it plain. Her eyes softened. Why me, then? He didn't flinch from her gaze. Because no one should be left like that. Not if I can help it. The quiet that followed wasn't heavy, it carried something else. Something neither of them had a name for yet. Later that night, as the fire dimmed low, Eli lay on the cot, while Ayanna rested on the floor nearby. Through the dark, her voice came soft as smoke. You're not like the others. He didn't reply. His throat was too tight. But something in him cracked open, something that had been locked away for too damn long. For the first time since Ayanna Redbird had come into his life, Eli McGraw wasn't worried she might leave. What unsettled him now was the thought that she might stay, and what that truly meant. Morning broke crisp and clear after a night of restless quiet. Eli had barely shut his eyes. He laid there staring at the dark rafters long after her voice had faded into sleep. You're not like the others. Those words had sunk deep, stirring a part of him he thought long buried. By dawn, it sat heavy on his chest like a stone. He rose without a sound, pulling on his boots and going through the motions of another day, though his thoughts were far from steady. She was already up crouched near the hearth, feeding kindling to the fire. When he passed behind her, Ayanna looked up. Their eyes met for a heartbeat before she turned away. She held the blanket tighter around her shoulders, even though the chill inside the cabin had eased some. Eli noticed the pink in her cheeks. She wasn't starving anymore. The thin, haunted look had begun to fade. That brought a small sense of peace, but also made it harder to stop looking. He forced himself outside. The day was long and full of work. Eli set to repairing the corral fence, replacing the busted rails with cedar he'd hauled up weeks back. Sweat soaked through his shirt, his arms sore with every strike of the hammer. It was the only thing that could keep his mind from drifting to her, but it still wandered. He kept thinking about how she moved in the cabin now, less like someone passing through, more like someone claiming space, even if only a little at a time. By the time he returned at midday, the scent of beans and pork stew met him at the door. She'd cooked again. Without a word, she'd set 2 plates. They ate in silence. The fire snapped and popped between them, but something unspoken charged the air. Eli felt her eyes land on him. A couple of times, quick glances, unsure, and each time he looked up, she'd look away fast. After the meal, she spoke, surprising him. Before I was taken, I had a husband. She said, her voice flat but heavy. He died when the soldiers came. My people scattered. He didn't move, fork still in hand. I thought I would die too. Eli didn't press for more. The fact she'd told him anything at all said enough. I'm sorry, he said gently. She looked across the table, her eyes sharp, but not hard. You lost too. He gave a short nod. Wife and boy. Fever took 'em. The words settled thick in the room. 2 lives, 2 sorrows, sitting side by side in the flickering firelight. Neither of them said anything for a while. That night the wind rose again, making the shutters creak. Eli sat near the fire hands, busy repairing a rope. Ayanna stretched out on the floor, her blanket pulled close. She shifted once, then again. Too cold, she murmured. Embarrassed. Eli looked up then toward the cot. He hesitated. Cot's warmer, he offered. I'll take the floor. She paused, eyes meeting his. Then she shook her head. No. You stay. She tugged the blanket tighter. I'll be fine here. But later when he lay down, he heard her still shivering. He lay still, eyes on the ceiling. The sound gnawed at him. Finally, he sat up, grabbed his own blanket, and crossed the room. Without saying a word, he laid it over her. Her eyes fluttered open at the touch, dark, unreadable. Their hands brushed. Hers lingered just long enough for him to feel the heat. Then he stepped back fast and returned to the cot, heart thudding. The next morning, as Eli worked the fence line, a lone rider appeared over the ridge, Wade Boone. The bastard reined in his horse and didn't move, just sat there watching. "Word is you got company out here, McGraw," he called loud and smug. "They say she's Apache." That right, Eli turned hammer in hand, slow and steady. "You got business on this land, Boone?" Wade chuckled and spat. "Just passing by. Folks in town been talking, that's all. Saying you brought home a squaw like she was a pack mule off Silas Grady's wagon. Let folks say what they want," Eli said, voice low, tight with warning. He stepped closer to the fence. "You mind your land, I'll mind mine." Boone stared a beat longer, that smirk never leaving his face. Then he turned his horse and rode off, the stink of gossip trailing in his dust. Eli watched until he was out of sight. He knew damn well the man's words wouldn't die at the ridge. They'd spread, like fire in dry brush. Back at the cabin, Ayanna caught the tension in his shoulders. "Trouble?" she asked. "Just talk," he muttered, hanging up his hat. "But talk can turn ugly. Stay close. Don't go out unless you need to." She nodded once, jaw set. "I'm not afraid." Eli looked at her, really looked. For everything she'd been through, she still stood tall, still proud, still whole, in ways he wasn't sure he'd ever be again. That night, the firelight danced across the walls, long shadows flickering like ghosts of what had been, and maybe what could still be. Eli McGraw sat near the hearth, his rifle resting within arm's reach, while Ayanna Redbird leaned over the pot to stir. Her neckline slipped slightly worn fabric, losing its hold from too much use. His gaze caught for just a breath too long, chest tightening. He looked away fast, jaw clenched. Respect. That was the line he clung to, the one thing anchoring him. But she noticed. She turned her head just enough, her dark eyes catching his through the flicker of firelight. She didn't fix her dress, didn't shift to cover herself. Instead, she met his eyes head-on, her expression unreadable. Testing. Eli's throat went dry. He opened his mouth to speak, then shut it. Finally, in a low rasp, he said, "You're safe here. Don't ever doubt that." Her gaze softened barely, but it was there. She turned back to the fire, her mouth tight like she was holding something back. That night, when she laid out her blanket near the hearth, Eli lay awake on the cot, staring into the dark. Her presence filled the cabin more than ever. After a long silence, her voice came soft. "I think maybe you're different. Not all men are the same, Anar." He swallowed, hard eyes fixed on the ceiling beams. "I ain't perfect, but I'll never hurt you." The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, charged with something fragile and new. And for the first time since she'd come into his life, Eli dared to believe she might actually stay. The days that followed carried a different kind of weight. Eli saw it in the way Ayanna moved around the cabin, no longer hesitant, no longer like someone expecting to be cast out. She walked slower, looked longer, and the space between her words stretched out like she was finally choosing what to keep and what to share. He felt it strongest in the quiet nights, when the fire burned low, and every breath seemed louder than it should be. The morning after Wade Boone rode up with his snake-tongued remarks, Eli stood out by the corral, checking the fence. But his mind wasn't on rails or posts. It was on Boone's words, how they'd worm their way through town like wild thorns. Eli didn't give a damn what folks thought of him. Never had. But the thought of them speaking about Ayanna like she was a thing he'd claimed, it made his jaw lock tight. He had no pretty words to fight it, only a bone-deep promise he'd keep her safe. Inside, Ayanna had started making quiet claims on the space. She folded her blanket each morning without fail, kept the stew pot in the same spot by the hearth. One day she mended his old shirt, the one torn at the elbow. The stitching was crooked, but it held. Eli said nothing, just wore it the next day. And she noticed. Neither spoke of it. But they didn't need to. That evening she cooked again. 2 plates set before he even reached the table. They ate with the fire crackling between them. Ayanna's glances flicked his way, quick and uncertain. When he caught her eyes, she turned fast. Then she spoke. Before, I was taken. I had a husband. He died when the soldiers came. My people scattered. Her voice was flat, but every word landed heavy. I thought I'd die too. Eli didn't move, fork still in hand. He didn't push for more. But her telling it at all told him plenty. I'm sorry, he said quietly. He comes back. Maybe she murmured. Eli nodded once. If he does, I'll deal with it. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You protect me. Why? He set down the knife, looked her straight on. Because you deserve it. Simple as that. She held his gaze dark and searching, weighing every word against years of pain and betrayal. Then slowly she looked back at the fire. Her lips stayed tight, but her shoulders relaxed. The storm rolled in that night wind, lashing the cabin walls. Ayanna lay curled on her blanket near the fire. Sleep nowhere near her. She shifted, restless, the cold biting through the cracks. Eli watched from the cot, his chest tightening as he saw her curl in on herself. Finally he stood, grabbed his blanket, and crossed the room. You'll freeze without this, he said, kneeling beside her. Her eyes met his, half guarded, half something else. And what about you? I'll be fine, he said, firm and sure. She reached out slowly. Their hands touched longer this time. Neither pulled back right away. She pulled the blanket over herself, then paused, shifting it to one side, leaving space. Her eyes lifted to his, a question unspoken. Eli McGraw's throat tightened. Every part of him wanted to lie beside Ayanna Redbird, but he held firm, fighting the pull with every ounce of restraint. He didn't move until she whispered, I'm not afraid. Those words hit harder than a bullet. Out by the fence, a familiar voice cut through the wind. Heard you got company out here. McGraw. Wade Boone called out, his smirk spreading beneath that dusty hat. Word is she's Apache. That true Eli stood straight, hammer still in hand. Ain't your business, Boone. Wade let out a chuckle, spat into the mud. Town's buzzing, you know. Lonely man brings home a squaw bought off a trader. Folks get to talking. Let him talk, Eli said, jaw tight as fence wire. He stepped closer to the rail's voice like a low growl. You stay on your side of the land. I'll tend mine. Wade lingered just a second longer, eyes sharp with curiosity, then turned and rode off. Eli watched until he vanished down the ridge, unease biting deeper than the cold wind. He knew Wade's words wouldn't stop at that line they'd spread like wildfire through dry brush. Back inside, the silence between him and Ayanna cracked. The kiss that followed was soft, unsure, but it was real, an unspoken choice passed between them like a promise. His hand rose, resting gently on her waist, but he kept it there steady, waiting for her say. When she leaned in, deepening the kiss, instead of backing away, something broke loose inside him. For years, Eli had lived in the emptiness of grief, believing nothing could fill the hole left behind. But here in this cabin lit by stormlight with a woman who'd seen too much sorrow, something stirred back to life. When they finally parted, Ayanna rested her forehead against his. Her voice barely a whisper. "You keep saying I'm safe. Now I believe you. Leave." Eli swallowed hard, hand still warm on her waist. "And I'll keep on proving it." She caught him looking again, his eyes tracing the loose fall of her dress, and this time she didn't pull the fabric up. She didn't flinch or hide. Her gaze held his across the firelight, steady and unreadable, like she was testing the man he claimed to be. His throat dried again. "You're safe here," he said, rough and low. "Don't ever doubt that." Her expression softened just barely. She turned back to the fire mouth, tight, as if holding back something more. That night she laid her blanket near the fire. Eli lay on the cot, sleep miles away. He knew how the world saw her, just an Apache woman a man had brought home from a trader's hands. But she had stayed through one night, and then another morning. That choice meant more to him than any judgment whispered in town. When dawn broke after the storm, the stillness felt different. Eli stepped into the yard, boots sinking into damp soil. The sky above stretched blue and wide, the scent of rain-drenched mesquite hanging heavy in the air. Inside, Ayanna moved with quiet rhythm, folding blankets, tending the fire, setting the table just so. Her movements no longer carried that edge of hesitation. She wasn't waiting for the next bad thing to happen. She had chosen to be there. As the sun climbed, Eli worked the fence hammer in hand, but mind elsewhere, still circling back to her touch, her words, the warmth of her kiss. It had been years since anyone stirred that kind of feeling in him, and now that it had taken hold, he didn't want to let it go. Near midday, as he hauled water from the creek, 3 riders came over the ridge. Wade Boone again, this time flanked by Hank Dobbs and Earl Tully. They pulled up short, watching the cabin like buzzards eyeing fresh meat. Eli felt the knot form in his gut. He lowered the pail slow, his fingers brushing the butt of his revolver, but he didn't draw. Wade called out loud enough for the wind to carry McGraw. "Heard you got a squaw holed up in there. Bought her, they say. That don't sit right with good folks." Eli stepped forward, boots planting deep in the wet earth. "Ain't your concern what I do on my land?" Earl Tully sneered. "You think you can just bring one of 'em here, act like it's normal, ain't how things work." Eli's gaze turned cold. She's free. She stays 'cause she chooses to. And any man who says different can come test me. Tension hung in the air, heavy as thunderclouds. The 3 men shifted uneasily in their saddles. Eli's hand hovered near his gun, but his voice never trembled. Wade spat into the mud, jerking his reins. "You'll regret it, McGraw," he muttered before riding off. The others followed. Eli stood there unmoved until the dust settled behind their silhouettes. Only then did he breathe again. His chest still heavy, but his ground held firm. Eli McGraw turned back toward the cabin where Ayanna Redbird stood just inside the doorway. She'd heard it all. Her eyes met his, steady, unreadable. That night, after the last of the chores were done, they sat by the fire. The silence between them held weight, but it was no longer brittle. Ayanna stirred the pot slowly, eyes distant, lost in thought. At last, she broke the quiet. "If I stay, they'll hate you more." Eli leaned forward, elbows resting heavy on his knees. "Let 'em. I've carried men's hate before. It doesn't change who I am or what I do." She studied him for a long moment. Her lips pressed together, unreadable. "You want me to stay?" His throat tightened, but there was no pause in his answer. "Yeah. Not 'cause I paid for you, not out of pity. I want you here. With me." The fire danced across her face as she sat still considering. Then slow but certain she nodded. "Then I stay." The words landed like thunder in his chest, steady, final. For the first time in years, Eli felt something in him unlock. He reached into the old trunk near his cot, pulling out a small piece of iron he'd worked on earlier that day. It wasn't fancy, just a thin, smooth band hammered and shaped by the same hands that had built every inch of the cabin. Holding it out, he cleared his throat. "Ain't much," he said, voice rough. "But it's what I got. A promise." Her eyes widened just a bit. She took the ring gently, turned it in the firelight, then looked up at him. Her voice was steady. "I'll wear it. 'Cause I choose to." His hand shook just a little as he slid it onto her finger, his calloused fingers brushing hers. She didn't pull away. Her gaze never left his. Then she leaned in. Her lips found his in a kiss deeper than the first, sure, warm, full of more than just longing. It was belonging. A choice made freely. A promise neither of them would need words to explain. That night they didn't lie down as strangers bound by fate. They lay beside each other as two souls who had chosen this path. Eli wrapped an arm around her waist, feeling the warmth of her body against his, without fear or resistance. She whispered into the dark, "No one can take me now." His voice, rough but full of quiet power, answered, "Not while I'm breathing." Days passed. The town whispered louder, but Eli paid no mind. He only rode in when needed, and when men muttered behind their hats, he rode right past them. He'd outlived war grief, and years of being alone. No coward's gossip would shake him now. Back at the cabin, the earth softened under spring's touch. Ayanna planted seeds near the porch, pressing new life into the dirt with gentle hands. One morning she laughed soft but bright, as the horse bucked against the reins, stubborn as ever. That sound filled Eli's chest like the first breath after drowning. The cabin wasn't just a roof anymore. It was a home. The fire burned each night 2 places beside it, now not one. And when Eli lay down, her hand resting gently over the iron ring he'd given her, he knew deep in his bones his life had changed the day he'd spent his last $3. He hadn't bought her. He'd freed her. And in return she'd given him something he thought he'd lost for good, a family. Not by blood, not by law, but by choice.